I'm honored to introduce Amanda Lewis and John Diamond, our final speakers for the day. Their book, Despite the Best Intentions, How Racial Inequality Thrives in Good Schools, provides clues as to what might be causing racial achievement gaps in schools. Their research took place in a racially integrated, affluent Midwest community where white students routinely perform better than their Black and Latino counterparts, despite, as we see from the title, the best of intentions from leadership and staff. Their book helps us better understand the divide between desires and actions. Amanda Lewis studies racial dynamics in contemporary U.S. Her research focuses on how race shapes educational opportunities and on how our ideas about race get negotiated in everyday life. She is the author of the award-winning Race in the Schoolyard, Negotiating the Color Line in Classrooms and Communities, along with several other volumes. She is on the faculty in the Department of Sociology and African American Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. John Diamond is a sociologist of education who focuses on how race, ethnicity, and social class intersect with school leadership, practices, and policies to shape educational opportunities and outcomes. He is the Host Bascom Professor of Education at University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Education. Previously, he was an Associate Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and past Research Director for a consortium of U.S. schools that use research to address racial achievement disparities. I am pleased to welcome Amanda Lewis and John Diamond. And after their talk, they'll answer questions from participants.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really look forward to sharing lessons from our book and in some ways lessons we've learned from our research over the past several decades. My name is Amanda Lewis. I'm going to be starting the talk today, and then John will be joining us shortly. Before we get into the substance of our talk, we wanted to express our deep appreciation to the folks at Learning Forward for inviting us to share our work. And really to all of you for joining us for this really important conversation, even as we are all trying to navigate this rapidly changing and quite challenging set of circumstances in the world. We were originally hoping to all be together in the same space, but as with everything these days, we have to adapt. We believe strongly that the issues we're raising today actually, though, are particularly important to this moment because we continue to have to confront how unevenly the effects of the pandemic and its many reverberations are being felt across families, across schools, across different communities. John and I started this project with several big questions in mind. A core one for us was trying to understand in kind of deeper and more complex ways what role schools play in the production of what we have historically called the racial achievement gap. And I want to put that in quotes. Many people say, you know, don't blame schools for these things, blame the widespread and centuries old structural racism in this country. And in fact, we agree in a lot of ways, but we also think there's a great power in understanding the role of schools and school communities in either mitigating or exacerbating existing racial inequities. And we believe schools can only do better if we have frank and really nuanced conversations about how racial dynamics shape school experiences, practices, and outcomes. I want to briefly highlight what the study of this book is based on. Slide. So we studied a community called Riverview. Now, Riverview is, for us in many ways, what we might call a best case scenario. It's a very well-resourced community. It's a thriving town. It has been committed to diversity in the form of desegregation, in the form of commitments to actually reduce achievement gaps for decades. And we were invited into the school by an assistant principal who'd been there for a long time and really wanted to understand what they could be doing differently. We spent several years at the school. We ended up interviewing nearly 200 students, teachers, administrators, staff, parents. We also draw on survey data from Riverview and a bunch of other districts and collected scores of community, social, historical, and economic data. And if people have questions about this, we're happy to address them in the Q&A. Now, in a few minutes, John will get to the findings from our book, but first we wanted to talk about some of the core ideas that informed our project. And so one of the big questions we often get is this issue of how exactly race matters for school experiences and outcomes. This is our 30-second version of the sociology of race, just to let you know what we think is some underlying and really important core ideas that we have to grasp on before we can even begin to answer these questions. So race is a highly contested political and social construction. Our racial categories were invented, created in specific historical moments, and continue to evolve over time. They are not natural, biological, or genetic categories. So the core thing we want you to remember here is that race is not real. The creation of racial categories, however, and the emergence of racial thinking in the United States was centrally and always about struggles over resources. It was about justifying racial exploitation, racial violence, and the entrenchment of racial thinking was happening at the precise moment in our history when we were simultaneously forging this new country built on ideas of equality and building an economic and political system in which millions were being brutally exploited and fundamentally excluded from the polity. And this kind of racial mythology that began during this era and got built over and over time is still with us today and is part of how we make sense of race, racial matters, and racial dynamics. So that's, while race is not a scientific concept, in the minds and hearts of people in our daily experiences, race is very real. We have treated it as real for so long that it's part of the air we breathe. It's become part, over the last 400 years, part and parcel, embedded in our legal, political, social, and economic systems. It's diffused throughout our social life, part of the way we think about ourselves and others, and shapes our experiences and outcomes. And this graphic you see here, for us, sets up this kind of broad question. Why, you might say, do we spend a bunch of time before we even get to our findings on what we mean when we talk about race? And so much of it is it's essential to understand what we're talking about when we see things like, so we're going to be talking here in a minute about how race shapes achievement outcomes. But it's very important to think about what both of these squares mean. When we talk about school outcomes, it could be anything. It could be suspension rates, it could be reading scores, it could be placement in gifted programs, it could be one's sense of belonging in school. And in answering this question, it's really critical that we understand what it is that we think race means. And I'll give you an example. Next slide. So what does this little black line mean? What does it mean when we say race is somehow driving school outcomes? Race is almost always included as a kind of variable in educational analysis. I'm sure any school leader has seen lots of different versions of this in trying to understand what their school report cards and other things look like. But one of the things we want to fundamentally put on the table is that race can't predict achievement in the way that we often talk about it. As a socially constructed category, it shouldn't be an easy predictor of educational outcomes at all. And if it is so, it is because we make it so, because of social doings of some sort. To offer a kind of extreme example in some ways, when it was illegal in this country for a very long time to teach enslaved peoples how to read, of course they couldn't read for the most part. If we'd given those enslaved peoples academic tests of some kind at that moment and compared their academic tests to the academic tests of the children of slave owners, we would have found very predictable academic achievement gaps. Obviously, when we deny people access to knowledge, they don't have it. And it's not a sign at all about that group. It is a sign of the kind of larger racial dynamics that are shaping and structuring our lives. And part of the reason we set this up is because it is, even as that seems like an extreme example, it is also true that there has never been a moment in the history of this country when we have offered equal educational opportunities to all. And yet we often look at these kinds of formulas as if that is somehow the case. Therefore, race, we are arguing here, it has to be understood as a proxy for something else. And that has to be ideally theorized, measured, observed, and I'll give you a couple much more concrete examples, I promise. Next slide, John. When we look at something like this table, we ask, this is one example of what we often see as the data on Black-white achievement gaps. This is showing ACT score, math and reading scores from comparing actually between 1965 and 2013. And one of the things that we ask is, what does it mean when we're looking at something like this? Why does the whiteness of white students or the blackness of Black students matter at all for their scores? When we started this research, we looked at lots of these kinds of tables for Riverview itself, and I'll show you one later. But what we asked ourselves over and over again is, what is driving this? What are the kind of racial dynamics? What are the mechanisms? And what were the local stories about it? Next slide, John. So one of the traditional ways that people think about this, when they think about how race might be shaping school outcomes, is looking at these kind of traditional racial mythologies. So this kind of mythology rationalizes or normalizes large inequities in educational outcomes. It suggests that somehow it's about differences in culture or group deficiencies. And I don't here just mean like a wider uninformed public. I mean, even in the academic literature, when we look at these things, the second one down, peer relations or attitudes about school, are often used as ways of understanding how race, the kind of mediating relationship between race and school outcomes. The common parlance of this, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, is the idea that Black students are not achieving well in school because their peers discourage them from engaging. That school somehow is like a white thing, and that young people accuse each other of acting white if they try to take school seriously, and discourage each other from doing that, from really working hard, and that really that's what's going on. And you can imagine that this kind of framing suggests that the lever of change is really to change young people's attitudes. Now, when we started this research at Riverview, we felt obliged to at least modestly engage with this, even though I have to tell you, I once wrote an article about the 9 lives of this oppositional culture hypothesis, which is captured in this kind of peer relation theory. And I wrote that because over and over and over again, studies have shown that it's really not a main thing driving what's happening within schools, but it remains a very popular kind of theory for what's happening. And we hear it not only from people in schools, but often in pop culture. We've heard even former President Obama and others refer to the ways that Black youth sometimes, make fun of each other for carrying backpacks and all that sort of thing. So we in fact looked at this at Riverview before we did anything else. Next slide, John. So what did we find when we looked at this at Riverview? Across all these studies, and we drew this as both from our interviews with everybody in Riverview and from all the survey data. John, you can just bring up all of them here and I'll just review them. Thanks. That what we found, and this should be no surprise to anybody who's in schools every day, that all students at the school really valued high achievement and wanted it for themselves. We did find that kids sometimes got teased at the school for being brainiacs or nerds and that sort of thing. But the kind of teasing we found was not in any way race specific. There's one example here from a student named Paul, and he describes a guy he knows on his baseball team. He says he gets teased about, his engaging in school. He gets teased about it a lot. He's on the baseball team, so he gets heckled at practice. And the interviewer asked, because he gets good grades. And he said, no, everybody gets good grades. It's the way he talks, how he seems like a smart aleck, like stats. He'll memorize them and always talk about them, so nobody wants to hear that. And so this is the kind of thing we found across all young people. There's nothing specific about Black young people that had them doing this any more than anybody else. The other thing that we found is that young people are actually providing lots of support to one another, lots of encouragement to each other to actually do better in school. Example from this comes from our interview from Keisha. The interviewer asked, Do you and your friends discuss each other's grades? How do these conversations go? And Keisha replies, like, if it's a bad grade, we'll just tell each other, do your work. And if you need help, like, we can help each other. And if you get good grades, you tell them to keep up what they're doing. So again, across the surveys we looked at, across the interviews we did with young people, we found no evidence that, in fact, this oppositional culture was a pervasive thing or predictive at all of the achievement gaps we saw at the school. Next slide, John. And in fact, we found the kind of racial mythology, you might call them racial stereotypes, echoed in lots of different ways at the school. For example, we heard a lot of the white middle and upper class parents explain the racial achievement gaps at the school as being about differences in family values, even as we interviewed Black parents who are working incredibly hard to make the school work for their kids. And this is in part what's so powerful about thinking about that long history of race and racism when we think about what's going on in schools. When we confront the fact that we have never provided an anywhere near equitable educational to children, and yet when we begin to try to understand differences in outcomes, how and why we focus on these things rather than, next slide, John, these other things, we see how much, in fact, part of the role of race is to kind of naturalize the differences that we find. So we want to suggest that these are the kinds of things we should be thinking about instead when we want to understand the kind of macro level dynamics. In this way, sometimes John and I talk about our work as sort of naming what should be obvious, or making what should be familiar to all of us strange, at least, and trying to describe the processes and mechanisms that are unfolding so we can see them and therefore interrupt them. And John's going to give some examples of this in a second. But there are lots of ways, and for instance, when we think about this kind of model and this kind of the relationship between the things on this graph, it helps us to think about why it is that all kids are breaking rules, but only some kids are getting punished, or why it is that we are building things into our curriculum, building assumptions about that kids are going to know things that we haven't explicitly taught them, or why it is that parents who have connections, who have deeper social networks and powerful social networks, are able to translate them so often into advantaged educational experiences for their kids, or why it is not just nationally, but often locally, that families who have a lot of resources generally are getting access to much higher quality education for their children. Just to give one example of how these things work, one of the things that we point to, and that is worth paying attention to, is how racism functions not only in terms of disadvantage, but also in terms of advantages. So that one of the biggest indicators of racial inequity in the US today continues to be racial wealth gaps, gaps in wealth between groups. And they are large. They've actually only gotten larger in recent years as a result of the great the recession, and even because of the economic crisis going on currently. At this moment, estimates range a little bit, but the ratio in terms of wealth between families, between Black and white families, is about 20-1. Between Latinx and white families, it's about 18-1. So even when families have the relatively similar income and relatively similar education, their access to a strong safety net of resources in their family varies quite dramatically. And there's lots of interesting research about what the kind of consequences it has for schools. Not only about where kids can go to school, but the kind of choices their families can make, and all that sort of thing. Some of these dynamics are about high-level racial inequality, as we talked about before, but some of them are just about what happens in school buildings. And as we get back to our study at Riverview, when I have this example in here of symbolic capital, what we mean is the way that race, the way that when people look at another person and assign them a racial category, all the meanings that come along with that. That's not a neutral process. It carries with it a whole host of meanings that end up having positive consequences for some kids and really negative consequences for others. So in the book, we spent a lot of time trying to understand how implicit bias and racism on a kind of daily basis, how parents' social networks and knowledge about how to work the schools ends up really producing substantially different experiences for kids. And we do this and really get into the mechanisms, as John will talk about, because we are deeply invested in how schools can be doing better. I'm going to tell you two quick things about Riverview, and then John is going to take over. So this is what Riverview looked like. These are the demographics of the school when we were doing our work. As you can see here, it was a school that was almost evenly split between white students, with a substantial minority, a growing number of actually Latinx students at the school. Even though the teaching population was more white than the student body, there was a significant sort of critical mass of Black teachers at the school. And you can see the percent low income was not tiny, but was actually much smaller than the large city that the school was nearby. Next one, John. And I want to show you this as just one example of how people thought about and measured what we call the racial achievement gap at the school. This shows the kind of deep inequality. So if you went to Riverview, you could walk into the hallways and see an extremely diverse student body moving around. But when you actually went into classrooms, this is what you saw. And the kind of second generation segregation that people talk about, the question for us fundamentally is, here we are, not in 1950, but in the 2000s, and we are still seeing really deep kinds of racially academic hierarchies within schools. And what are the things in schools that help produce these kinds of things? And I will turn it over to John now to get into the details. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Amanda. So what I want to do is talk a little bit more about the sort of specific dynamics that happen in the context of the school, and we'll focus specifically on Riverview, as Amanda just suggested. One of the things that we want to think about is sort of these broad sort of ideological and structural mechanisms and how they sort of meet themselves out in a daily life of schools. So I want to talk specifically about three theoretical constructs or theoretical tools that we use to sort of frame how we think about these daily dynamics. The first is status beliefs, the second is organizational routines, and the third is opportunity hoarding. When we think about status beliefs, we can think back historically to the sort of ideological structure that undergirds racial oppression in our society. Status beliefs are widely shared cultural beliefs that people who belong to one social group are more esteemed and competent than those who belong to another social group. So we can think about this with regard to race historically in the ways that people have often attached sort of intellectual ability, criminality, and other sort of positive and negative attributes to racial groups. These status beliefs actually construct and justify forms of inequality. So people are able to say Black kids aren't doing well in school, for example, because of the perception that they're not invested in school, or because there's negative peer pressure happening, as Amanda has already outlined. What these ideas do is they sort of rationalize and justify some people being on top of social hierarchies and other people being at lower levels in social hierarchies. The other piece of this that Amanda sort of suggested before is that status beliefs lead to differential performance expectations for people. So folks are often likely to assume in places like Riverview that the Black and Latinx kids are not going to do as well, or also to assume that those kids are more likely to do things that should lead them to be disciplined. Now, it's one thing to think that these ideas are sort of out there and exist in the environment, but it's another thing to think about how they get deeply embedded into people and how people think and see other folks in the society. When someone walks in a room, why do people assume that their race has real meaning in terms of the person's character, knowledge, and ability? Well, one way to think about this is how status beliefs spread. Children become conscious of race between the ages of 3 and 4. They start asking questions. They start wanting to understand what race actually means. But by middle childhood, those broader racial stereotypes become something that people come to see as real in the world, right? So ideas about white people being more intelligent than Black, Latinx, Native American people tend to emerge in people's consciousness in middle childhood. The other piece of this is that these ideas spread through people observing how people are treated in the society and looking at who's in power in the society. So if you look at the US Senate, for example, it's almost all white men, right? With a few white women and a few Black men and women in the Senate, right? That is the seat of power. But when you look at schools, over 80% of teachers and administrators are also white. So the power dynamics that people see and the structure of inequality in a society that gets reinforced in schools in some ways is meted out by that itself. The other piece of this, though, is that people see status beliefs being reinforced by the behaviors that they witness. So watching somebody be treated negatively because they're African American, for example, leads white people to who observe that kind of treatment to treat other African Americans in the same way. And this has been demonstrated experimentally by people like Cecilia Ridgway and others. The second big idea that I want us to think about is the idea that we put forward in the book around organizational routines. Now, organizational routines are sort of the basic building blocks of any organization and how an organization works. They're sort of taken for granted ideas about how schools should function, how organizations should function, and people sort of understand their role in these organizational routines. But it's important to distinguish between organizational routines in the abstract and organizational routines as they're actually carried out by people in real world contexts. So we talk about two different aspects of organizational routines. The first aspect is the ostensive aspect or the ideal of the routine. The second is the performative aspect or the practice of the routine. The practice is real people in real spaces functioning together in real time and space to get something done. And this is where we think the ideas around status beliefs and race and the historical construction of race become really important because they embed themselves inside the everyday functioning of organizational routines in ways that reproduce inequality. The ostensive aspect, on the other hand, the ideal of the routine, is often stated in race neutral terms, but it functions in this performance in racial terms. For example, we can think about how an organizational routine like discipline might be shaped by people's perceptions of the people and the status that they hold in people's minds. So one study sort of demonstrates how this might work. A group of preschool teachers were asked by folks at the Yale Child Studies Center to observe a group of 4 children sitting at a table. They were preschool age children and these were preschool teachers. They were asked to look for misbehavior. On the video, there was a black boy, a white girl, and a black girl sitting, playing. There was no misbehavior, but the psychologist asked them to look for misbehavior. And what happened when they tracked these people's eyes is that they spent most of their time looking at black boys and white boys, but more often black boys were the target of their focus, right? With the girls, white girls are slightly more likely to be looked at than black girls, but you can see that the misbehavior that people were looking for, they looked to black boys more often than anyone else, and they looked to boys more than girls. So we can see the sort of intersecting nature of these ideas around race and gender. Remember, there was no misbehavior, but the perception was there was likely to be misbehavior, and folks looked and tracked the eyes and looked accordingly for that misbehavior. The final idea that I want to talk about is opportunity hoarding. Opportunity hoarding is the process through which dominant groups take control and try to monopolize control of resources in the society. Historically, as Amanda already talked about, US whites have hoarded educational opportunity by establishing separate schools for African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, as well as, sort of outlawing the ability to learn how to read, for example, during the period of enslavement. Riverview teachers and administrators talked about the fact that even in the contemporary context, middle and upper class whites often engage in opportunity hoarding behaviors. And we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So let's enter the school. If we walk through the hallways at Riverview and we think about the organizational routines, we can pay attention to things like the beginning of school routine, the class routine, the changing of periods, the lunch periods and lunch breaks. We can also think about things like discipline, course placement, grading, and parent-teacher communication as really important to shaping how those organizational routines play out. In all of the routines, they're stated in race-neutral terms. And we saw that that ostensive aspect of routines to be legitimizing. The performance of the routines is actually where the reproduction happens, where race gets instantiated and embedded in the school, and where racial inequality gets reproduced. So let's talk a little bit about school discipline. If we think about school discipline following a set of processes, we would think that people are selected into discipline because they misbehave. They're processed through discipline. And then after that, the disciplinary outcomes happen, right? And it seems like a fair and race neutral process. But when we talk to people in the school, we got sort of 2 stories at the same time. So Mr. James, who's a Black Riverview security guard, says, the discipline handbook, that's our guide. It tells us the discipline rules. It tells us the consequences. We don't care if you're white, Black, Hispanic, Russian, Asian, Hebrew, Chinese. We're going to follow that book. And that's just where we are. I come into this building. I don't see colors, I see people. There are no favors. But in the same interview, Mr. James says the following, and this is how discipline actually works. I don't think the have-nots are always treated the same. I think if your parents can afford lawyers and are very educated, you might stand a chance of getting away with something. The have-nots, they're generally seen as rude, disrespectful, and impolite. And they don't generally get away with it because for the most part, the have-not parents are not going to come over here and deal with it. You can see here how race and expectations around behavior and the idea of certain kinds of behaviors among the have-nots, who he identifies with African Americans, being rude, disrespectful, and impolite, is one of the ways that the dynamics of the organizational routine or the performative aspect of the organizational routine embeds inequality in these processes. So a couple of examples. Students in the school are not supposed to be in the hallway during class periods without a hallway pass, right? But one of the things that we found is that was not enforced equally, right? As one white student, Maria, says, I think security guards point out African Americans a lot more than like white. Like I'll walk down the hall without a pass and they'll just let me go. But then they'll find someone else and say, you have a Saturday detention. I think it's really uncalled for the way they don't stop everyone. And Maria is identifying this pattern of both the sort of over-enforcement and hyper-surveillance of Black students and the freedom that she sort of has as she's moving through the hallways. Another student talks about it this way. Some students aren't given a chance the second they walk through the door. If you've got some cornrows and if you're coming in with some big low clothes on, the teacher's going to be like, here's a troublemaker. When you see a boy walking with some khakis and a dress shirt on, you don't feel the same way, right? So Jen is identifying this same pattern, but also associating it with certain kinds of cultural styles that people have. And the African American cultural styles, or those that are identified with Black people, are the ones that are highly scrutinized. Another way to think about this is to think about how appropriate dress is sort of enforced in the context of the schools, right? So as the discipline book says, brief revealing clothing is not appropriate at school. Examples include tank and halter tops, garments with spaghetti straps and strapless garments, clothing that is see-through, cut low, or exposes one's midriff, or skirts that are 3 inches above the knee, or shorter than 3 inches above the knee. So again, the gendered race sort of interplay here is clear. This is really about girls and young women and what they should be wearing. So there's a gender dynamic, but it also plays out in racial ways. And there's sort of highlights the ways in which there's sort of an intersectional process happening here. As one Riverview teacher talked about this policy, she said, we had a policy that girls couldn't have their bellies out. All you saw walking in the hall was girls with their white bellies out, Black girls sent home. Black girls were pissed off. Another way that this works is a differential processing of drug possession, which we should see as sort of a clear violation of school rules. But there are ways in which parents leverage, particularly white parents, leverage their positions to sort of impose their will in this process. And we see this in some ways as a form of sort of white symbolic power functioning, but also of opportunity hoarding. As one Riverview administrator said, I have had parents come in and appeal white students' disciplinary actions. Their issue isn't how do we get it out of the record? I'm sorry, their issue is how do we get it out of the record? Can we not call it that because we don't want to affect college admissions? I'd say I have about 20 times a year, a student gets caught with in possession of some marijuana. The parent argues that we call it possession, and possession means you have it, it's yours to manipulate and sell. It was never his, the parent says. He was just looking at it. So that possession is not real possession. So you can see how parents in this situation are trying to manipulate the process, and they're using the power of their structural position to sort of influence what's happening. I want to shift gears now to talk a little bit about what we're doing now, which is we've gone back to Riverview to try to understand what's happening in the more contemporary context. This is essentially 10 years later, and we're really trying to figure out what has changed in Riverview. Now, you remember Amanda showed you the sort of differences in course placement in the school, that about 90% of the students in AP classes were white, about 80% in honors classes were white, and then students were more mixed in the regular level classes, but white students were sort of by far disproportionately represented in the higher level classes. So one of the things that the new superintendent who came into the school wanted to do was figure out, how do we address this? He tells the story of having walked around the school when he first got there and walking into one of the regular level classes, sitting next to a young Black boy. And the boy looked up at him and said, "You don't want to be in here. This is the dumb class." For him, this was sort of led to an increased motivation to really figure out what should be done to address these inequalities that existed in the school. So one of the things that happened is Riverview began to really try to reduce the number of course levels that they had. So initially in the past, students were placed in the course levels by test scores, and they recognized that this was a problem. So in the first stage of this change, they started placing students in mixed level classes, particularly in the humanities, social studies, and English classes, so that students would get an exposure to honors level work in hopes that they would be encouraged to take honors level in the future. The second stage was for them to offer an attained honors credit for students who were in these classes that were mixed level, so that more students would be prepared for moving into the higher level classes. And then they sort of included this process in the sciences as well, so that by the time these changes were finished, and pretty much all of the course levels, they were able to sort of create a situation where young people could move to different course levels, be exposed to honors level, but then get honors credit and hopefully move to AP level. They did a similar thing in mathematics, because one of the challenges that they recognized was that 8th grade math, and particularly algebra class, was a real gatekeeper for getting to higher level mathematics. If you look at the chart on the left, what you see is pre-algebra in 8th grade means you do not get to calculus by 12th grade. You may get to pre-calculus, but not calculus. But if you take algebra 1 in 8th grade, you're likely to get to potentially AP calculus by the time you get to 12th grade. Similarly, some students were taking geometry, so they even had a chance to go even further. In all cases, the algebra class was predominantly white, and the pre-algebra class was predominantly Black and Latinx students. So in this process, the district really worked hard to create classes in 8th grade algebra that were the same, tried to make the pre-algebra class essentially the same class as the algebra class, by changing the number of units that were taught in, to become equal in the two classes, using the same textbook. But what wound up happening is he, sort of initially saw that when he walked in the classrooms, he saw real big differences in who had access to those classes. He says, if I had gone 3 years ago walking around, you could have predicted just by walking into the classroom that the kids of color were in pre-algebra getting 2 less units. The kids in algebra 1 were all white, and almost exclusively in algebra 1, kids were going on to get calculus in high school, right? And so they created these identical classes so that they could give everyone algebra in 8th grade. But what wound up happening when they went to the board meeting is they still experienced resistance. And this is another example we talk about with regard to opportunity hoarding. He says, by the time we got to the board meeting, we basically could say, hey, kids are getting the same scope and sequence, the same book, the same material. We don't need it pre-algebra. We can get rid of it. And there was still pushback at that board meeting. There were several community members saying, you're downgrading the quality of instruction, and predominantly from white people, exclusively from white people, right? So this resistance sort of emerges as another mechanism of opportunity hoarding and slowing the rate of change. It goes on to say, the frustrating thing is I thought when I came into this job, we can take care of this, talk to people, engage people and look them in the eye, and we can get this done in a year. It took 4 years to make that sort of change, right? So there is this resistance, right? But I do want to tell the story of what did wind up happening from these changes, right? So having to work through this resistance, having things take a much longer time, the outcomes to some extent were good. But I'm going to tell you the bad as well. So there was an increase at the high school in the number of people taking AP classes between 2007 and 2017, or in 2017. there was a 35% increase in the number of students who were taking AP classes, at least one AP class by the time they graduated. There were also changes in the number of students taking AP exams. It went from 38% in 2011 to 64% in 2016-17. So again, a 35% increase here over this time period in the number of students taking AP exams. Now the bad. The racial patterns still remained, even though they did these interventions and they targeted particularly increasing the number of African American and Latinx students taking these courses, the racial patterns still emerged. If you look at the top line, 87% of white students were taking AP classes by the time they graduated, 43% of Latinx students and 36% of African American students. So Black students saw a 13% increase, Latinx students saw a 26% increase, and white students saw a 28% increase, and the hierarchical structure still remains, right? We can also see these differences in GPAs, right? In 2019, there were still gaps in GPA for the district. There's a 2.8 average GPA across everyone, but if you look at Asian students, both men, boys and girls, if you look at male and female white students, they're up at 3.5 and 3.3, 3.2 GPAs on average. Black students, Black girls 2.6, Black boys 2.3, Hispanic students 2.7 and 2.6. So you see these gaps still remain even with the efforts to make changes in the context of the school district. And we argue that these challenges are rooted in these processes of status beliefs, these processes of opportunity hoarding, these processes of lower expectations for certain students, and organizational processes that don't do quite enough to equalize the outcomes that students are experiencing. So real quickly, before closing, I want to talk a little bit about what we think with regard to ways in which we can try to change schools. Part of our effort has been to help people see things differently. We try to introduce new ideas about race, new ideas about the ways that race plays itself out in the context of schools, and we try to disrupt this thinking. We have to remember that 84% of teachers in schools generally are white. Many of them have not reflected on their whiteness or reflected on the ways that race actually plays into their teaching practices, their expectations, or the processes that happen in the context of schools. So one of the first challenges is to really disrupt people's thinking and rather give them new tools for thinking about ideas. And these new tools relate to things like organizational routines, status beliefs, and the like, and issues like opportunity hoarding. We then want to provide new theoretical tools and experiences for understanding race. So it's not just about talking to people, but it's about a deep engagement around learning and experiential learning and trying to take the ideas of change to practice, which is where we have really benefited, I think, from drawing on work in organizational improvement, particularly thinking about work from Tony Bright, Luis Gomez and their colleagues, work on diagnosis and design, to really begin to think about how organizations change and to wed these ideas about change to the sort of critical perspectives that we bring to the fore. We also work hard to help educators understand in a deep way how racism and white supremacy are embedded in core organizational routines. By paying attention to the idea that if schools continue to function the way they are, if you don't take decisive action, the inequality will get reproduced around race. And the final thing we try to do is give people ways to think about how to deconstruct organizational routines, break them down into their constituent parts, and really be clear that the idea of the routine may sound good. The practice is where we have to pay attention. Where are things breaking down? Where's the disjuncture between the ostensive and performative aspect of organizational routines? And then how do we go in and redesign organizational routines to get the outcomes that we really want and pay close attention to how we get those kind of outcomes? So I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your time and energy. And I really look forward to engaging people in a conversation about some of the ideas we've shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your really thoughtful and very helpful words. I'm already seeing some great comments and questions in the chat, including somebody who was telling us that many of the examples that you shared are things that she sees all the time happen in schools. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. You started to talk at the end about disrupting organizational routines and changing the routines to make them more equitable. Can you give us some advice about where to start? I know you mentioned that you have some tools for rethinking routines, but for our audience members who are here today and who say, I really want to work with my colleagues to start looking more critically at our organizational routines, how do you get started?
I guess I could start with that. One of the things I've been working on for the last several years is a project called Forward Madison, which is a partnership between University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Madison Metropolitan School District. And through Forward Madison, what we've tried to do is think about how do you enter and begin to make changes to produce more racial equity. And one of the things that we've sort of learned in that process is that one of the critical things that you have to do is think about what you're already doing and think about how to make what you're already doing bend toward creating more racial justice. So, for example, all school districts hire and induct new educators every year, right? And in places like Madison, you're talking a couple hundred new teachers a year, many new principals. They have to go through induction processes. Well, how do you create induction processes that help make people aware of the racial inequality that exists and give them tools for thinking about how to change those inequalities, right? There's also coaching and mentoring processes. Well, how do you make those robust processes that allow people to become better prepared to educate a broad swath of students? There's cooperating teacher processes. So we've been working on that. When teachers are coming into schools and learning from new educators, we need to be careful about picking those educators who are really good at educating Black and Latinx and Asian and all students, right? And when they're apprenticing into teaching, they need to be apprenticing in ways that are productive. A lot of things that we're already doing in schools can be made better, can be broken down and reconstructed in ways that focus on equity. And that's one of the ways that I think this sort of plays itself out.
I think the only thing I would add to that is one of the sort of highlights, one of the things that John was talking about towards the end there, which is that part of what we're trying to do is also to get people to have a different frame for some of the things that they've already known. So for instance, a lot of the times when we go meet with a superintendent or a principal, and we're talking about them about data and patterns they see in the school, they say we are Riverview. They say they see the same things as we see at Riverview. They know it's happening. And part of what we are trying to get people to do is to see those patterns as things that they both can intervene on, and to understand the things that are producing them are things that are at least partly under their control and in their domain. So just one way of thinking about it is when we name the kind of ways that white families or powerful families engage in opportunity hoarding, it's a way of helping to get educators and particularly school leaders to think about, there's lots of things that parents do that we don't always love as educators. There's lots of important things that parents do. We love parents, of course, we're all partners, of course. But if we name the kind of resistance that parents have to equity work, right? If we name the kind of things that they're doing to slow equity work down, to get in the way, to block change, if we name that as a kind of opportunity hoarding and name it as being similar to and part of a long continuum going many decades back of white people in particular organizing to block change that's going to advance racial equity, it makes you think a little bit differently about how and where and how quickly one needs to respond to kind of change the policies and practices that are rewarding that kind of behavior or at least enabling it. So some of it is, in fact, not necessarily helping people to see things that they never saw before, but having really different kind of frames for it and different a sense of like responsibility for it.
Let's keep talking about opportunity hoarding for a moment, because there have been some questions about that as well. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, do you see a role for helping build the cultural and social capital of families who have historically been left out of it, to help them, for example, advocate for their children to be in 8th grade algebra classes? Or is the responsibility really more on the system to change the policies and the systems?
I'll start and then I'll let John tie it all together. So I would say, son, I saw in the chat somebody's mentioning that Nice White Parents podcast. Absolutely, there's some great examples and data from New York about that, about similar kinds of patterns. This is not new. Like I said, John and I are very explicit in the book to saying this is part of a continuum of anti-busing, a long part of efforts of people doing this kind of work. And I think what's really important is we talk in the book about how other families, Black middle-class families, somebody in the chat also asked about class, are also trying to advocate for their kids. Everybody loves their kids. Everybody wants their kids to do well. Part of what happens is that in part it's about who's successful at it, right? So we talk about what Black parents are doing is more as opportunity prying. They're trying to do this. It doesn't work as well for them. The school pushes back more. But I think that the main thing I would say is it's really on schools and school administrators to think about the ways that some of the policies they have set up make this possible. And we have lots of examples we see in school districts where suddenly a district will say, oh my gosh, I realize that the class placement policy that we have makes it possible for parents who are a little more connected to get into better classes. And so there's lots of things that we're doing that we can just change. And what we challenge people to do is say, you either need to name that as a policy, you either need to say connected families are going to get a better experience. And if you don't want that to be your policy, then you need to change the practice associated with it. So there's actually lots that schools and districts are doing that they could be doing differently to try to deal with the fact that it really is schools and districts' responsibilities to try to make sure that all kids have an equitable experience. John, I'm gonna let you take it to the next level.
I don't know if I can do that, but I can say that I think about this a lot in my own situation, because there are some advantages that I have as somebody who studies education and is a professor at a university. When I advocate for my son in school, I'm advocating on his behalf, but I'm also advocating for policy changes and structural changes that will affect everyone. If it's not good for my kid, I try to advocate for, the district really needs to be thinking about changing this for everyone. And I think, part of the orientation really does have to be thinking not just about education as a scarce resource, but thinking of education as a resource that everyone should have equal access to or full access to, and thinking about the fact that we can advocate, but we can advocate for our own children, but also for the community as well.
I do want to follow up on the questions about social class and socioeconomic status. There are a couple of questions in the chat about the methods of your study. One was about whether you looked at socioeconomic status and its impact on these patterns. And another was if you looked at schools where white students were in the minority, and if you continued to see the same kinds of patterns about white students having more access to educational opportunity.
Yeah, I would say that, one of the things that's really interesting about these differences, these racial differences and outcomes, is that when we think about social class, one of the things we have to think about is what Amanda said before about wealth. Even at the same social class level, wealth disparities are huge across Black folks and white folks, Latinx folks. So we do have to think about that. But one of the interesting findings that exists is that in places where social class is relatively equal, the gaps, the differences, the racial differences in outcomes are even bigger. And communities like Riverview present one example of that. And one of the arguments that we make, and one of the arguments that has extended out beyond the book, is the fact that in a lot of ways, it's the piling on of resources to the most highly resourced families that tends to create sort of the racial patterns that we see and make them even more stark. So it's not that social class is driving these inequalities, but it is that the advantages that accrue to people who have resources and the opportunity hoarding processes that schools reward tend to make things even worse. There's also a conflation of race and class. That means a Black child walking into a classroom gets the disadvantages of people's status beliefs around social class that are sort of intertwined with people's perceptions of race that actually creates sort of a double whammy.
We don't actually look at places where in this project anyway, where white students are in the minority. I think there's lots of interesting research about that though. And the two things I would point to is one, there's lots of evidence that even working class and poor white kids are much less likely to be in schools of concentrated poverty. So middle class Black kids are much more likely to be in schools with a lot of low income kids in general than even poor white kids. So there's lots of interesting ways that race and class intersect. And then there's some interesting research by, for instance, Edward Morris, who's a faculty member in Kentucky, he wrote a book called Unexpected Minority, showing that even when white kids are kind of in the minority in a school, there's lots of benefits that accrue to them. I think it's sort of like research we found in workplaces and other spaces where where in fact it's not about being a numerical minority or majority. It's about all the kind of racial stereotypes, racial mythology that's in our larger culture that is pervasive everywhere. So.
There are a couple of questions about resistance and about particularly if there's resistance from the administration. And I'm wondering if you have some advice about the kinds of strategies or actions that people can take if they feel like they don't yet have a supportive administration.
Okay, well, I'll start this one, John. We'll keep trading off. So I think, resistance comes in lots of different forms. I mean, we have to fundamentally, part of the reason why we embed these conversations in trying to get people to think about how race works in a much larger sense is that it helps us to understand that these issues, these questions are always in some ways fundamentally about power. Part of the reasons that we find that a lot of administrators resist these conversations or resist engaging in this stuff is that it's very challenging, partly because of resistance from families. So one of the administrators that we know that has done a lot of really good work in this area has had multiple organized campaigns to get him fired from his job since he started doing this work. Now, there are other administrators who resist doing this work because they believe in the racial mythology. There are folks who decide that really it is about young people and it's about their attitudes and, believe that good intentions are enough. And I think a lot of the work there is really about asking people to look at their data and to look very carefully, not that the data itself already has a story embedded in it, but to begin to unpack what the patterns are and to begin to unpack the school's responsibility for doing better than they already have. John, I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that we sort of recommend to people is, if you're trying to make change, and this is not just the resistance that comes from inside the school, but by folks who want to keep things the way they are, is as you're planning your change, you can have a really nicely designed change process. But if you don't plan to have people who are running interference to keep those opportunity hoarding parents out of the mix, or at least figure out how to handle them ahead of time, you're going to run into problems. So you have to plan for the resistance and figure out ways to subvert it, or you're going to run into real problems. I mean, part of the challenge is to sort of work on those people and help them see that the outcomes could potentially work in their favor. The other piece is to actually figure out how they're going to try to attack what you're doing and undermine it. For example, the district administrator who put forward this plan for 8th grade algebra was very clear that if I make these classes identical, I know I still may get resistance, but it's really hard to argue that they need to be separate classes when they're identical classes, right? And then you put it in the face of people, hold a mirror up to them and say, okay, so what are you arguing for, right? So it's about, in part, eliminating the sort of leverage points that people have through your preparation and your action.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that Carly says it's almost like a PR campaign. It is almost like, it's exactly like a PR campaign, that some of this is recognizing that you need to do work to get people to come along. You need to be transparent about what you're doing. You need to be clear about what you're doing. You need to anticipate, as John said, anticipate and plan for resistance. All those things make a difference. Again, I saw several people mentioning the Nice White Parents podcast, and I think the other lesson from that, which we've also seen in lots of other places, is some of this is also just about courage. There's a superintendent that gets interviewed in that podcast who says she came into the job and saw the really deep moral crisis, I think that was her language, around the middle school admissions process. And when she's interviewed, they say, why didn't you do anything about it? And she gives lots and lots of, well, who's in charge and this and the other person, and it's sort of the district responsibility. So there's a lot of ways in which, as Charles Payne wrote about years ago about urban schools, there are large diffuse systems, and it's easy to look at other people and to say that they're really the ones who are in charge of things. But much of the time, it's just about trying to help people have the courage they need to make the really necessary change.
That's a great message. And yesterday afternoon, Dean Valerie Kinlock challenged all of us to think about what am I willing to give and what am I willing to give up, as well as what am I willing to stand for and what am I willing to not stand for. So I think your message will really resonate with all of us to have courage and to do the work that it takes. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you to help us close out the conference. Before we're done for today, Fred and Denise have a few words to say to wrap up the conference.
Amanda Lewis and John Diamond capped our learning together with such valuable insights. I know you join me in offering another round of gratitude to all of our conference speakers and facilitators. I also want to thank our Chicago Host Committee one more time. Like educators around the world, they adjusted their plans on the fly to ensure we'd have an amazing time together. And please, take time to complete the survey to offer input on this virtual experience.
I speak for the entire Learning Forward staff and Board of Trustees in thanking you, our participants and colleagues in professional learning. We so appreciate that you chose to join us online for these 3 days of incredible learning. We so look forward to being with you again very soon. Next year, we are planning to see you at the annual conference in Denver, Colorado. Until then, be well, take care of yourselves, be safe, and thank you for all that you give to our students, our educators, families, and communities.